This is the lecture on free appropriate public education. My name is Dr. George Giuliani from Hofstra University, and today we're going to be talking about the free appropriate public education principle under IDEA. Now, prior to the passage of Public Law 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, many students with disabilities were often excluded from school entirely, and many others were offered an education that was not appropriate to their needs. And when Public Law 94-142 was enacted in 1975, it required that the states submit plans that assured all students with disabilities the right to a free, appropriate public education. And again, if this is not something you understand or something new to you, review the lecture on the history of special education, which will talk about Public Law 94-142. But ultimately, Public Law 94-142, our first federal law on special education, known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, was enacted in 1975. And one of the principles under that act is that it required the states to submit plans that assured that all students with disabilities had the right to a free, appropriate public education. And today, IDEA requires that all states demonstrate that they have in effect a policy that assures all children with disabilities the right to a free, appropriate public education. So in 1975, when this was enacted, and still today, all states have to assure that children with disabilities receive a free, appropriate public education, what I'll continue to call a FAPE from this point forward. Now, if you go to IDEA and you look up FAPE, you will actually find a very specific definition under IDEA. And FAPE is defined as the following. It is special education and related services that are provided at public expense, under public supervision and direction, and without charge. It meets state education standards. It includes preschool, elementary, or secondary school education in the state, and it's provided in conformity with the Individualized Education Program, the IEP. So again, when we look at the definition of a FAPE, what do we see? It's special education and related services that first are provided at the public expense, okay? It's going to be paid for by the public, by the school district in a sense. Public expense, it's under the public supervision and direction without charge. It has to meet whatever the state education standards are in a particular state. We're talking about preschool, elementary, and secondary school education. And a child receiving a FAPE has to match up with his or her IEP. Now, when you talk about a FAPE, you're talking about a free, appropriate public education. There are two words in there that are critical, free and appropriate. So let's first talk about the free. Okay, what does it mean free? Well, this is the easy part in a sense. IDEA clearly requires the provision of a free, appropriate public education. And free, as you know, means without charge or cost. Provisions of the education, therefore, must be at no cost to the parents. IDEA requires the provision of educational services to all eligible children with disabilities and makes no provision for refusing to provide those services because of cost. And when looking at the legislative history in the creation of Public Law 94-142, Congress said, the committee rejects the argument that the federal government should only mandate services to handicapped children if, in fact, funds are appropriated in sufficient amounts to cover the full cost of this education. So the idea behind all of this is that funding cannot be a concern when you're looking at appropriateness. Lack of funds may not limit the availability of appropriate educational services to children with disabilities. Cost of services is insufficient as a defense under the federal law. And the U.S. Department of Education has emphasized that it is important that school districts never make FAPE decisions on the basis of cost, but rather that the decisions be based on the individual needs of a particular student. So again, if a child needs a particular service and it's appropriate for that particular service, which we'll talk about later in this lecture of what defines appropriate, the cost of the services can never be a defense under the federal law. The school district can't say, we'd like to give the services to the child and we believe the child should have the services, but it's just too expensive. That cannot be the case. Now, cost considerations, the only time we can consider cost considerations, they are only relevant when choosing between several options, all of which offer an appropriate education. But when only one is appropriate, then there is no choice. Let me repeat that. Cost considerations are only relevant when choosing between several options. So when you have various options, then cost considerations can be looked upon. But all of them have to offer an appropriate education. But when only one consideration is appropriate, then there is no choice. Now, let me explain how this plays out. Okay, suppose we had a child with a disability, and that child needs a calculator to do simple math problems. Okay, so this child with a disability, say, has a learning disability in math called dyscalculia, and this child needs a calculator to do simple kind of basic math problems. All right, let's suppose we have the first calculator, calculator A. It's a basic calculator. Calculator A has been found to be appropriate for this child, and calculator A costs $50. There's also an upgraded calculator that performs basic functions, but also does higher math problems, and that's calculator B. Well, calculator B is also appropriate for this child, but calculator B costs $100. And then there's calculator C. And calculator C is a super deluxe calculator. It does every math function imaginable. And calculator C is appropriate, and it costs $300. So the school district here has a choice of calculator A, B, and C, and all are appropriate. The school district can choose the least expensive calculator, calculator A, provided it can show that calculator A is appropriate. And this is the only time when a school district can say it can choose calculator A because it was the least expensive of the three options, because all three options were appropriate. Now, that's the key element here. Calculator A, calculator B, and calculator C were all appropriate. And given that they were all appropriate, the school district can then choose the least expensive one, because in this instance, calculator A was still appropriate to meet the individual needs of the child. So, final point on payment and cost. Uniformly assessed fees are permissible to parents of children receiving special education services. A fee for a service may be charged to parents of students with disabilities only if this is a fee on all students in the school. The term "at no cost" does not preclude incidental fees that are normally charged to students without disabilities or their parents as part of the regular education program. So again, the definition of special education is specially designed instruction at no cost to parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. At no cost to parents. But uniformly assessed fees are permissible. Now, what are we talking about with uniformly assessed fees? Well, think of class dues. Everybody pays the class dues. The general education students pay the class dues. The children with special needs will pay. If there's a field trip that the children are going on and the field trip costs $30, let's say, well, that can be charged to the parent. If there's a class activity fee or the purchase of a musical instrument for a music class, say the recorder, when children in the third grade have to play the recorder and it costs maybe $10 for that recorder, everybody gets charged for that fee, and therefore the child with a disability can also be charged for that fee. So the term "at no cost" doesn't preclude incidental fees that are charged to all the students in the classroom as part of the regular education program. This ends part 1 of the lecture of Free Appropriate Public Education. You can now go on to part 2.